There is a photograph that circulates every so often among Spanish tennis fans. A small boy, no older than 4, holding a racket nearly as tall as he is, standing on a court in a town most of the world had never heard of before he made it famous. He is not smiling for the camera. He is watching the ball, already. Nobody asked that boy if he wanted this life. Nobody sat him down and offered him a choice between tennis and anything else a child might dream of becoming. By the time Carlos Alcaraz was old enough to have an opinion about his own future, the decision had, in a very real sense, already been made for him, by a family name, a small local club, and a bloodline that had been waiting for a champion for over a decade. We talk about Alcaraz today as a phenomenon, the youngest world number 1 in history, a multiple Grand Slam champion, the most electric player of his generation, but almost nobody talks about the years before any of that, the years when he wasn't a phenomenon at all. He was simply a child, born into a family obsessed with a sport he never actually chose, carrying an expectation that had nothing to do with his own dreams and everything to do with everyone else's. This is not a story about a wrist injury, or a slump, or a rival closing the gap. This is an older story, and in some ways a sadder one. The story of a boy who was handed a crown before he understood what it meant to wear one, and who spent the rest of his childhood learning how to carry weight most adults never have to touch. Because to understand the fearless, explosive champion the world sees today, you first have to understand something uncomfortable. Carlos Alcaraz didn't choose to become a king. He was raised to become one, and somewhere in that difference lies the real story of how he got here. To understand what Carlos Alcaraz was born into, you have to go back before Carlos existed at all, to a family whose relationship with tennis was already decades old by the time he took his first swing at a ball. His grandfather, Carlos Alcaraz Sr., helped build the Real Sociedad Club de Campo in Murcia, the very club where the entire family would eventually be rooted. His father, Carlos Alcaraz Gonzalez, was a talented junior player himself, once ranked among the best in Spain at his age, before life pulled him toward coaching instead of a professional career of his own. By the time young Carlos was born in 2003, tennis wasn't just a sport in his household. It was the family business, the family identity, and, whether anyone said it out loud or not, the family's unfinished business. Carlos picked up a racket at age 3, not because a scout discovered him, not because a coach spotted some rare gift in a talent search, because that's simply what happened in his house. His father ran the tennis section at the family club. His older brothers played. The court wasn't a place he visited. It was an extension of home. By 4 years old, he was already competing. By 5, he was beating children years older than him. And by the time he was 7 or 8, something had shifted in how the adults around him talked about his future. This was no longer a boy who happened to enjoy tennis. This was, in the eyes of his family and his local community, a boy who might finally deliver what an entire lineage had been building toward for 2 generations. Spain, at that exact moment in history, was also quietly searching for its next great hope. Rafael Nadal was already tennis royalty, already approaching the back half of an era-defining career. Every Spanish tennis fan, every academy, every federation official knew that eventually, someone would have to fill that void. Nobody knew who yet, but a small, fearless kid from Murcia, tearing through junior tournaments with a game that looked nothing like his age, was starting to draw exactly that kind of attention. At 14, everything accelerated. He left the family club, the courts his grandfather built, the town he grew up in, to join Juan Carlos Ferrero's academy, a serious professional training environment, built for players who were already being treated less like children and more like future assets. He was still a young teenager. He was already living away from home, training under a former world number 1 who saw enough in him to reshape his own coaching career around this one player. By 16, he was making headlines. By 18, he was the youngest world number 1 in ATP history, a Grand Slam champion, and, almost overnight, one of the most famous young athletes on the planet. The timeline that most fans know, the meteoric rise, the trophies, the rivalry with Sinner, is the part of the story that gets told the most. But it's also the part that happened after the real decision had already been made, years earlier, by people who loved him, in a household where tennis was never really presented as optional in the first. There's a particular kind of pressure that only exists for children born into a legacy they didn't choose, and psychologists who study young athletes have a name for it: inherited destiny. It's different from ordinary ambition. An ordinary athlete decides at some point that they want to chase greatness. A child living under inherited destiny never gets that moment of choice. The chase begins before they're old enough to understand what they're chasing, or why. For Carlos Alcaraz, that inheritance came from multiple directions at once. There was the family layer, a grandfather who built a tennis club, a father who almost went pro himself and instead funneled everything into coaching the next generation. Every hour young Carlos spent on court wasn't just play. It was, whether stated directly or simply understood, an attempt to finish something his own father never got to complete. Then there was the national layer, arguably even heavier. Spain doesn't produce ordinary tennis prospects quietly. It produces them under a spotlight already primed by Nadal's dominance, already hungry for the next name to carry that torch. By the time Alcaraz was a teenager showing real promise, he wasn't just representing his family anymore. He was, fairly or not, being measured against the greatest Spanish player in history before he'd won a single professional title. And then there was the business layer, the part fans discuss the least, but that shaped his adolescence enormously. Academies invest heavily in prodigies. Sponsors sign teenagers on the promise of who they might become. By the time Alcaraz moved to Ferrero's academy at 14, leaving home, leaving his childhood friends, leaving the courts his family had built, he wasn't just a promising junior anymore. He was already, in a very real financial sense, an asset. People's careers, reputations, and paychecks were being built around the assumption that he would become exactly what everyone believed he could become. Consider what that does to a child's psychological development. Most teenagers get to fail privately, to try things, quit things, disappoint people in small, forgivable ways while they figure out who they are. Alcaraz didn't get that luxury. Every loss as a junior wasn't just a loss. It was a data point in whether the investment, familial, national, financial, was going to pay off. That is an extraordinary amount of weight to place on a person who hadn't even finished growing. And yet somehow, instead of collapsing under that pressure the way so many prodigies before him have, Alcaraz became known for the opposite quality: fearlessness. He played like a kid with nothing to lose, smiling through pressure moments that made grown men tighten up. It's tempting to call that natural talent alone. But some who study young athletes suggest something more complicated might be happening underneath that joyful exterior, that the fearlessness wasn't necessarily the absence of pressure, but a coping mechanism built specifically to survive it. Smile through it, play loose. Because the alternative, carrying that weight visibly, the way it was actually felt, might have been unbearable for a child that age. Somewhere in the years between a toddler swinging a racket nearly as tall as himself and a teenager becoming the youngest world #1 in tennis history, Carlos Alcaraz stopped being simply a boy who played the sport his family loved and became something closer to a project, a carefully built, heavily invested answer to a question an entire country had been asking since Nadal first started slowing down. None of that makes his achievements less remarkable. If anything, it makes them more complicated and arguably more impressive than the highlight reels suggest. Most champions get to choose, at some point, whether to keep chasing greatness or to walk away toward an ordinary life. Alcaraz was never really given that fork in the road. The path was laid down before he understood what a path even was, by a grandfather who built the club, a father who saw his own unfinished ambition reflected back at him, a nation hungry for its next icon, and, eventually, an entire academy and sponsorship machine that had already placed its bets on who he was going to become. What's remarkable isn't that a child raised under that much inherited weight became good at tennis. Plenty of prodigies do, for a while, before the pressure eventually breaks something in them. What's remarkable is that Alcaraz found a way to carry all of it and still look, for years, like the freest, most joyful player on tour, smiling through pressure points, playing without visible fear, as if none of that weight had ever touched him at all. Maybe it did touch him, more than anyone fully realized at the time. Maybe the fearlessness the world fell in love with was never really about having nothing to lose. Maybe it was about a boy who had everything expected of him from the very beginning, choosing, somewhere along the way, quietly, without ever announcing it, to make that inherited destiny his own anyway. Not because he was forced to want it, but because somewhere between the small courts of El Palmar and the biggest stadiums in the world, he decided the crown fit, even if he never got to choose whether to wear it in the first place. He didn't ask to be a king. He built an empire anyway. Every champion has a moment where the story really begins, and for Carlos Alcaraz, that moment happened before he could even spell his own name. If this documentary gave you a new way of seeing him, hit subscribe. We tell the stories the highlight reels leave out.